we had a lady from, what town was it? I think she was from Belleville, Agnes Burns Wieck.
Did you ever hear her speak then?
Yes. The only thing I remember about her, although I didn't do anything about it, was that she was a communist.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, she was a communist. You're putting this on tape.
These days, with organized labor struggling to reassert itself, it's hard to imagine the Illinois Mine War of the 1930s. During its remarkable first year, some of the most militant action was organized by women of the coal fields, miners' wives, mothers, and daughters. And that action was led by one woman in particular.
She was a school teacher. And I remember she saying this, and she got up and said she was a second-rate teacher, but that she would never let her children pledge allegiance to the flag. So wasn't she a communist?
She was not a communist, in fact, but Agnes Burns Wieck was a remarkable American labor leader. She helped redefine the role of women in the labor movement and led perhaps the single most important rally ever organized by women unionists. And she's been almost forgotten. I'm Kim Holmes. This documentary, We Were Not Ladies, We Were Women, tells the story of Agnes Burns Wieck and her role in the Illinois Mine War. It was produced by Greg Boozell.
In perfect order, each dressed in white, a white band around her head, they assembled. They came marching from every corner of the state with their banners and their music. They came in rattletrap Fords, in trucks, on trolleys. They came from the Midlands, which has borne the brunt of the fight against the Peabody Coal Company and John Lewis's strikebreakers, the part of the country where militia and gunmen have been terrorizing the miners for the better part of a year. As they approached the Capitol, the women broke ranks and surged like a sea of white through the open space before the building and up the steps. Agnes Burns Wieck stood near the parapet bordering the statue of Lincoln, raised her fist and cried in a loud voice, "Solidarity." Mary Heaton Vorse, New Republic.
That march on the State House in Springfield on January 26, 1933, was inspired by a violent coal strike that set Illinois miners against one another. Illinois emerged as a major coal-producing state in the late 19th century, and the Illinois coalfields became a stronghold of organized labor, too. By the 1930s, tens of thousands of miners in central and southern Illinois organized under the United Mine Workers of America banner. Illinois District 12 made up 1/4 of the union's membership, and its rapid growth was in keeping with the core values of Illinois miners: democracy and autonomy. But these principles ran counter to the goals of the United Mine Workers president, John L. Lewis. For years, Lewis had worked to centralize power within the UMWA and grappled with the Illinois miners for control of District 12.
John Lewis had destroyed the autonomy of every other state in the coal-producing state in the Union, and we were not about to submit to the destruction of our autonomy in Illinois.
Jack Bottuello was a leader in the Illinois miners' movement in the 1930s. In this 1973 interview, he describes his discontent with the United Mine Workers back then. It was an opinion shared by many Illinois coal miners.
I don't know that I can explain it or analyze it too graphically, but Illinois has been the stronghold, been the bastion of the miners' union all through the years since its organization of the United Mine Workers.
In 1932, a coal strike gripped Illinois. Coal companies demanded wage reductions, while the miners repeatedly voted to reject the cuts.
United Mine Workers union officials attempted to end the strike by imposing a labor contract on all the Illinois miners.
Sean Burns is a union organizer and a relative of the 1930s labor leader, Agnes Burns Wieck. She was his great-aunt.
Supported by the coal companies, this contract would have substantially cut the miners' wages. But for that contract to take effect, it would need to be ratified by the majority of Illinois miners through a statewide vote.
The United Mine Workers leader, John L. Lewis, couldn't persuade the majority of UMWA members to accept the contract, so he took matters into his own hands.
When it becomes clear that the contract would be voted down, that the tally sheets are stolen, and the United Mine Workers President John L. Lewis unilaterally declared the new contract in effect.
Recognizing their ballots had been usurped, tens of thousands of Illinois miners voted with their feet and abandoned the United Mine Workers to form their own union, the Progressive Miners of America. They vowed to retain their autonomy and to win the strike. Again, here's Jack Bottuello.
When we had finally decided that we were not going to let John Lewis either lower our wages or take away our autonomy, I, in all of my 74 years, have never experienced such a spirit of cooperation and enthusiasm as I witnessed then. It did something that I have never seen again in my life. Overnight, instantaneously, it seemed we had decided to be brothers.
But the coal companies recognized the new contract with Lewis and the United Mine Workers and attempted to reopen the mines. To break the strike, coal companies recruited workers from neighboring states to join the few Illinois miners that remained with the United Mine Workers. What had been a relatively peaceful strike was now marred by widespread mayhem. Miners who refused to return to work were attacked on the picket lines and at public demonstrations as the coal companies and their allies in the United Mine Workers tried to break the strike with violence. Within this tumultuous conflict, a new force emerged. The miners' mothers, wives, and daughters organized to become coalfield hellraisers in the new union. And on that chilly, overcast January day, 10,000 women of the newly formed Illinois Women's Auxiliary of the Progressive Miners of America marched to support the strike and protest the violence that gripped downstate Illinois. It was led by Auxiliary President Agnes Burns Wieck.
How is the strike to be won? Can it be won by injunctions and political maneuvering? Or with our insistence on militant policies and action?
I'm Caroline Merrithew, and I am a professor at the University of Dayton, where I teach early 20th century U.S. history, and my research on Illinois coal miners led me to Agnes. Agnes was born in Sandoval, Illinois, which is a small southern Illinois coal mining town. People describe her as frail, as sickly. I think that she probably, again, like many coal mining people, was undernourished. So I think she showed the signs of this toll that mining life could take on someone's body.
She was one of 9 children born to a coal miner, Patrick Henry Burns.
Sean Burns.
I think originally the family came from western Kentucky, but of course, like a lot of coal mining families, they moved to where there was work.
Coal mining was a brutal and dangerous way of life that barely offered a subsistence living for workers and their families. In the 19th century, workers began to organize to challenge the lethal conditions of the mining industry. Agnes's parents worked and sacrificed to establish the United Mine Workers of America in Illinois. Historian Caroline Merrithew.
Agnes's mother was heavily involved in the union struggle and for recognition of the UMW. And during that period, because she was even more deprived of food and necessary sustenance for her life, it's speculated that Agnes's mother actually contracted consumption and tuberculosis during that period, and her health really declined as a part of those union organizing activities that she did. And then within a couple of years of the recognition of the UMW, Agnes's mother dies. Agnes took on a lot of the responsibilities as a young girl of the caring of family, her brothers and sisters, as well as her father.
But Agnes was a bright student and earned a college degree. She became a school teacher until a tragedy ignited her social conscience. In the spring of 1914, the Colorado State Militia and private mine guards attacked striking Colorado miners. More than 20 died in the infamous Ludlow Massacre. Most were women and children asphyxiated in a deadly blaze ignited by coal company guards and the militia. Agnes Burns Wieck described her transformation in Labor Age magazine.
I was a good teacher. I didn't know any better. I taught my pupils the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States. And then one morning I read in the paper of the battle at Ludlow, where women and children were shot by soldiers and burned to death. Liberty and justice for all? I vowed never again to teach the children to say the Pledge of Allegiance.
Agnes quit teaching and won a scholarship to attend the organizer school of the National Women's Trade Union League in Chicago. Sean Burns.
Agnes was a female labor organizer at a time when you wouldn't have had very many female labor organizers. She had an instinct for wanting to get involved in the political sphere. And as a woman in a coal camp in the 1930s, the 1920s, a woman wasn't going to go into the mines. She couldn't get elected formally to the union. So she took the doors that were available. And then I think most remarkably, she created her own notion of how women could become involved in the politics and the economics of their own lives through the labor union.
Catherine DeRoy Mans was a child during the mine war. In this 1975 interview, she shares her impressions of Agnes Burns Wieck.
Well, there's a personality that I don't think could be duplicated any place. She was short of build. She was dynamite. And she wasn't afraid of anybody. But she was a wonderful person. She was sympathetic. She would listen. She would discuss problems, regardless of whether she agreed with you or not, and walked away as friends. There was never any bitterness. And she really had the labor movement at heart.
After working as a labor organizer for several years, Agnes returned to Illinois and married Edward Wieck in 1921. That December, they had their only child, David. Several years later, Agnes began writing for the Illinois Miner, the official newspaper of Illinois District 12 of the United Mine Workers.
If the woman at home has to pay so dearly, and if not only in submission and endurance, but sympathy and active cooperation are expected of her, then why not grant her a say in the calling of a strike, in its settlement, or in its calling off? The Women's Auxiliary seems to offer a way to reach the women for just such an expression of this opinion. The union man's wife should no longer be in the position she holds today of being able to vote on political issues while she is denied a vote on industrial and economic issues. Mrs. Lotta Work, a.k.a. Agnes Burns Wieck.
The idea of a ladies' auxiliary to a labor union was not new. Traditionally, auxiliaries raised money for relief efforts and hosted social activities, and they were subordinate to the men's union. But the split among Illinois miners created an opening for a new kind of auxiliary, and a new kind of auxiliary leader, as Agnes wrote in a letter to a friend in 1932.
I was stuck out here in the country, tied down with canning and preserving, and shut out from the world that I belonged in. But the sight of all those thousands of marching women while I was off and the farm was forgotten, and I haven't stopped since. And now I am state president of the Illinois Women's Auxiliary of the Progressive Miners of America. Isn't that a grand and glorious title?
When the Progressive Miners was organized, they changed the name to Women's Auxiliary because we were not ladies, we were women.
A founder of the Illinois Women's Auxiliary, Irene Allard, describes the auxiliary's origins in this 1974 interview.
Lady, you think of royalty. A woman is a coal miner's wife. A ladies' auxiliary, you think of all kinds of little church groups and that kind of thing that would never go on a picket line or never fight in a miner's fight.
And the first thing you know, I looked out the window one day, and here was all these women. They were going to go marching out of the Bunnell or something, and they were all dressed in white, you know. They had the white uniforms and the little caps on their heads.
Lena Doherty lived in Tovey, Illinois during the mine war. In this 1986 interview, she shares her first impressions of the Women's Auxiliary.
I said to my sister Mary, I said, my God, look, there's Mrs. Wilson, there's so-and-so. They never left home, never even went to the grocery store.
I said, what are they doing? She said, they're going to march. The progressive movement was on. I didn't even know what it was all about. I couldn't believe it.
We went on the picket lines with the men. We went to their meetings. We supported them in every way that we could, see? And I think the men, they knew what they were seeing, what actually was happening, so they became proud of us.
Typically, when a coal strike occurred, workers and employers honored picket lines and the mine was closed until the dispute was settled. By halting production, the workers gained leverage needed to win the strike. In the past, these strikes worked because support for union miners ran deep in Illinois communities. Union solidarity was woven into the fabric of coal towns. Crossing a picket line was unheard of. Further, local officials and even state legislators relied on the votes of coal miners. Mine owners knew this and were forced to negotiate. But now Illinois coal miners were deeply divided. John L. Lewis had signed a contract with the coal companies to resume operations of the mines. Lewis and the coal operators claimed the strike had been settled. But most Illinois miners had left the UMWA to form the Progressive Miners, and they were still on strike. That left the coal companies and the United Mine Workers with a major manpower shortage. It was a rare situation. One union was collaborating with a coal company to break the strike of a rival union by recruiting strike breakers, some from out of state, Kentucky, or even West Virginia. As a teenager, John Witka joined the United Mine Workers and crossed the Progressive Miners' picket lines. He describes his experience in this 1986 interview.
So how old were you when you started working in the mine?
17.
17 years old. Were you a UMW worker?
Yeah.
Your father never joined the Progressives either?
No, we did. That's what. See, we was a strike breaker. We was a strike breaker during trouble.
Yeah. Okay. How did the community feel about you being a strike breaker?
You should never live through that.
Really?
That was horrible.
Were there a lot of strike breakers from? Where were most of them from? If they were from outside of this area?
Southern Illinois, Kentucky.
What were they like?
They was humans like we are. They just out for work. They got a job, and that was it. And everybody went for survival. They went where the money's at.
The mines became militarized zones. The governor imposed martial law, and the state militia occupied several coal communities, returning time and again for years to come. Coal companies deployed armored cars and stationed armed guards at the mines. Scores of UMWA workers were deputized, functioning both as miners and local law enforcement. The Progressive Miners, in turn, tried to enforce their picket lines. Not surprisingly, this volatile mix could result in tragic violence.
My name is Dominic Bertinetti, Jr. Keep in mind, I was a lad from age 3 to age 9 during the mine wars in the 30s. And what I remember seeing with my eyes, I can readily attest to. What I heard through my ears, my parents discussing the mine war incidents. I don't know if those stories are true, and I don't know that they're not true. I am the grandson of Emma Cumerlato. During the mine wars in the 30s, she was murdered, lost her life during the Midland mine wars.
On January 3, 1933, the Battle of Kincaid erupted in a tiny community southeast of Springfield, Illinois, when Progressive Miners attempted to enforce a picket line at Peabody Mine No. 7. A dozen people were injured, and 3 died in the clash. Predictably, the two sides had different versions of what happened.
United Mine Workers Journal. Guns flashed in Kincaid, Illinois at Peabody Mine No. 7 when a mass of picketers representing the Progressive Miners Union wantonly fired into a group of members of the United Mine Workers who were unarmed as they emerged from the mine from their day's work. Mrs. Emma Cumerlato was accidentally killed by a stray shot as she stepped out on her porch.
On January 3, 1933, our brothers in Christian County clashed with several hundred strikebreakers, deputy sheriffs, and mine guards in what has been called the Battle of Kincaid.
Agnes Burns Wieck.
20 people on both sides were injured. The great tragedy was the death of Emma Cumerlato, devoted auxiliary woman. She was sniped by a Peabody gunman as she opened the door to her husband under gunfire from the nearby Peabody mine.
And my grandmother, having seen what was happening up in the mine yard, was worried about the safety of her son, Dominic Camerlato. And she was standing out on the porch looking up the street for his arrival when the shooting started. And her porch where she was standing was sprayed with bullets, and one of them hit her in the chest. She went into the house, and my Aunt Gina was there, and my Aunt Gina says, "Mom, have you been hit?" And my Aunt Gina said my grandmother put one finger up to her lips, like to say, you know, be quiet. Get me a towel. She said, get me a towel. And my aunt got her a towel, and she held it to her chest and dropped to the floor, dead.
We were scared, and I'm sure there were some thugs.
United Mine Workers member Jesse Lake crossed the picket line at Peabody Mine No. 7 on that day. He spoke about it in 1986.
Maybe I shouldn't say Peabody thugs. I'll call them the company thugs. And the other ones probably had the guns. So evidently the company brought those guys in to intimidate the progressives.
3 people died in the Battle of Kincaid. Mine guard Vincent Rodems, James Guy Hickman, a deputized UMWA replacement worker, and Progressive Miners Auxiliary member Emma Camerlato. Since the Camerlato home faced the mine yard, it was likely she was shot by a coal company guard or a deputized UMWA miner. But of the 33 murder indictments, all were served against members and supporters of the Progressive Miners and the Women's Auxiliary. The violence triggered the redeployment of the state militia in and around Kincaid, which only made matters worse. Even the solemn tone of the Camerlato funeral was disrupted by the state militia, which now occupied the tiny community.
At her funeral, the display of military power of the state and federal government was an insult to the dead. Guardsmen surrounding the Camerlato home and the words of the minister were interrupted by the roar of huge army planes zooming down at the little house.
I can remember my mother telling me that while the minister was talking, that no one could hear him. Because I guess it was National Guard airplanes, biplanes, were flying very low overhead, and so that the noise was such that people couldn't hear what he was saying.
The Progressive Miner. At the cemetery, the Women's Auxiliary of the Progressive Miners of America conducted the funeral services. A tribute expressing the gratitude and love of the miners' wives was delivered by their state president, Agnes Burns Wieck.
Today, we bury a woman, the mother of 3 children in Christian County. How long must we suffer these tragedies? How much longer can we suffer the starving plight of our children and the wanton killing of their fathers and mothers?
Given the one-sided nature of the indictments, many believe the Christian County State's attorney sided with the United Mine Workers and used the murder indictments to harass the Progressive Miners. But lacking evidence, most of the indictments were eventually dropped, and the 2 progressives who were tried were acquitted. Echoing a pattern that would repeat itself time and again in the mine war, no one was held responsible for the violence that day. The epidemic violence in Christian and Franklin counties threatened the safety of their communities and the success of the strike. The Progressive Miners hoped that the newly inaugurated governor, Henry Horner, would intervene to protect their rights. Only a few weeks after the Camerlato murder, the Illinois Women's Auxiliary of the Progressive Miners of America organized a mass march to the state capitol in Springfield to deliver their demands. An estimated 10,000 miners' wives marched, led by Agnes Burns Wieck. Agnes's grandnephew, Sean Burns.
One of the things that the Women's Auxiliary was very good at was organizing themselves and organizing public demonstrations. And probably the ultimate rally occurred in January of 1933 when 10,000 miners' wives marched on the state capitol to petition the governor.
have come to the seat of government in our state to seek redress from the oppressive and intolerable conditions in the coal fields of Illinois. When it was no longer possible for our men to have a voice in determining the condition under which they worked, they broke away from that organization and established a new union that is responsive to the wishes of the rank and file. A reign of terror resulted, in which officials of the old union, the coal corporation, county and municipal authorities, and even the state joined, clubbing, tear gassing, shooting, killing our people, bombing our homes, making it impossible for us to assemble or to enjoy any of the rights to which the Constitution of this nation entitled its citizens. We respectfully petition you. Not only is our welfare at stake, but our faith in the ability and willingness of government to protect and serve us is menaced. Dare you fail us now?
The women were dressed in white. They had red scarves. They had their progressive miners' uniform. A powerful visual statement. But I think it also shows, though, just that this was a life and death struggle for these women and for these men. I mean, this was literally, people who were having a hard time coming up with the means of which to feed their families.
Agnes later wrote in the auxiliary's first annual report,
"This great march aroused public sympathy and increased the prestige of the new union as nothing else had done. It proved to the public that the PM was the union of the miner's choice and put the issue of civil liberties to the forefront. It showed our women what organized action can do and what power lies in their hands. It has been called the greatest women's march in labor history."
The march demonstrated Agnes's ability to organize, but it also marked rising tensions within the fledgling union. Among the progressives, too, some were wary of radicalism or communism. In fear of being branded as an agitator by progressive miner leaders and state government officials, Agnes tore up radical banners that some of the women brought to the march. But that did little to mollify the more conservative progressive leaders, and Governor Horner didn't back up his supportive words with meaningful action. Sean Burns.
During the march on the Capitol in January of 1933, ultimately the women did have an audience with the new governor. And I'm sure they had to understand that they were being given probably platitudes, but they had to make a good faith effort to go to the governor, to employ the governor to do the right thing. And so Governor Horner assured them that he would look into the problems of civil liberties being trampled. And for Agnes and her fellow, left-wing progressives in the movement, they knew better.
You're listening to We Were Not Ladies, We Were Women, the story of Agnes Burns Wieck and the Illinois Mine War, produced by Greg Boozell. Our story continues in a minute. This is We Were Not Ladies, We Were Women, a look at the life of Agnes Burns Wieck and her role in the Illinois Mine War. For Agnes and the militant wing of the Progressive Miners of America, the split from the United Mine Workers wasn't simply a factional conflict dividing Illinois miners. This struggle would determine whether a union's power could be wielded autocratically by its leaders, or if the miners' union would be governed democratically by the men and women who made up the mining communities. This schism in the Illinois coalfields provided an opportunity for Agnes and her peers to advance the principles of radical democracy.
Left politics in the 1930s. Well, what was left politics? My name is Rosemary Foyer, and I'm a historian. I work at Northern Illinois University. Left politics were a vital part of American history. If you look at a map circa 1912 of socialist local election holders, you find this whole country, and especially Illinois, had a vibrant socialist movement. People were elected to political office at the local level, and despite the attempt to say this was an un-American, imported idea, it was pretty vital. In Illinois, the mine workers were socialist. They were the most important district in the entire United Mine Workers early on to develop a strong socialist tradition.
Sean Burns.
It was an idea of unionism that was based on a class consciousness, a community consciousness, that it wasn't simply legalistic, but rather that there was a social contract that needed to be respected, that the women were a part of that. It's an idea that is really kind of lost in America. The idea that industry that comes into a town owes something to the community that helps build the wealth of the industry.
Agnes put it this way.
The red doesn't stand for communism. Our women like the word militant. They don't like communism. The red stands for the blood of our dead.
Too often, when people are called militants, we use a war metaphor.
Rosemary Foyer.
To be militant meant to be violent. And the fact is that a lot of these radical militants had imbibed a nonviolent strategy. And they did see themselves as part of a nonviolent tradition. And so when they went on their marches, they went unarmed for the most part. The main perpetrator and the main beneficiary of the violence are Peabody Coal, the other coal companies, the UMWA officialdom. Those are the groups that are really trying to protect the status quo and the perpetrators of violence.
In an effort to settle the conflict, the progressive miners repeated the proposal to hold a new district election and let the miners decide which union would represent them. But United Mine Workers leaders knew they would lose if the issue were put to a vote. They were adamant that no new election occur.
John H. Walker, president of the United Mine Workers, District 12, said the United Mine Workers would continue the same policy as it had in the past, that the suggestion for a referendum vote to decide what union would control in Illinois would be suicidal. United Mine Workers Journal, February 15th, 1933.
In the 1930s, the state's largest coal operator was the Peabody Coal Company. To win the coal strike in Illinois, the progressive miners needed to shut down the Peabody mines. Peabody operated large underground mines in an area called the Midland in west-central Illinois, and in counties to the south in a region referred to as Little Egypt. The progressive miners had some success enforcing the picket lines in the Midland mines, but the Peabody mines in Little Egypt were United Mine Workers' strongholds, fortified by hired guards and local law enforcement. Attempts to support the strike, particularly in Franklin County, were often answered with violent attacks on dissident miners. By November 1932, many progressive male organizers abandoned efforts to organize in Franklin County. But if the progressives failed there, Illinois miners would remain divided, and the United Mine Workers and Peabody Coal Company would prevail. Upon taking office in the newly formed Illinois Women's Auxiliary, Agnes renewed the effort to organize Little Egypt, exposing herself to great risk. She later wrote,
"The work of winning Little Egypt to the new Union, and thereby strengthening the strike upstate, was the first undertaking of the state auxiliary. The word progressive could scarcely be whispered in the South when I planned to invade this territory."
Franklin County was a county where anyone who wanted to even speak about the progressive ideas was really risking not just losing their job or being kicked out, but of literally losing their lives.
Sean Burns.
Even though the men of the progressives may have decided that it was just too dangerous, the Women's Auxiliary continued to agitate in Franklin County. On at least 2 occasions, Agnes snuck in under sort of, the cloak of night to go to meetings to speak.
Catherine DeRore Mans was a child during the mine war. Her mother, Sister Katie DeRore, was a key auxiliary leader in southern Illinois. The DeRore home in DuQuoin, Illinois, often served as a launching point for organizing in adjacent counties. In this 1975 interview, she describes the work of the Women's Auxiliary in southern Illinois.
If Mom had to go any place, she would usually leave real early in the morning before daylight so that she would be out on the road when it was dark. And Agnes Wieck would come and They would always have to travel by night.
In these southern counties, the women developed an unorthodox approach by forming women's auxiliary chapters before the men's locals went progressive. The women's militance wasn't lost on John L. Lewis. His reaction was to mock the progressive men in the press.
It is one of the regrettable facts in this situation that the progressives have found it necessary to hide behind women's skirts. Always before, men of the coal mines were able to fight their own battles. John L. Lewis.
Joe Ozanek was a member of the Progressive Miners who would later become president of the union. He describes his experience in this 1974 interview.
I remember when they would start bringing those imported scabs and strikebreakers to fill the mines in Taylorville, Christian County, and the women's auxiliary went along. And I saw some of them auxiliary women walk right up to a militiaman, put their hands on him. You're not going to use that gun on these men behind me. Those are my sons back here. And I seen some of the militiamen sweat like hell, too, being ashamed of being accosted by a woman, you know, because they'd be on the picket line. Yeah.
Many would argue that it was the women that kept the men from going back in the mines or going back to the United Mine Workers.
Sean Burns.
These were women that didn't just go out on the line, they risked their lives. These were women that were being threatened with guns, they were beaten, they were chased down the street by police, by armed thugs.
Historian Caroline Merrithew.
David, her son, says Agnes carried a pistol in her purse, which is so striking to me because why does she need a pistol? Or, you know, why does she have the sense that she needs a pistol? Because she's getting beaten up, she's getting threatened, right? And she's getting attacked.
We weren't safe in the house.
Catherine DeRore Mans.
We called them thugs. They were deputized people. Would come up and down the street in the daytime, and at nighttime they'd shine flashlights in the windows. But I know every time we'd hit the floor and crawl under the bed for fear of our lives.
Law was in the pocket of either industry or the UMWA. Miners that were scabbing became deputies and armed. So their militancy was really quite in line with insisting that the government abide by the rules the government actually had in place.
Still, the determination and heroism of the women resulted in some important victories. Large mines located in Perry, Saline, and even Franklin County voted to go progressive. But Governor Horner was unable to curtail the violence or restore civil liberties in the coal fields, and his efforts to broker a settlement between the rival unions failed too. Unwittingly or deliberately, the actions of the state and federal government favored the United Mine Workers. The struggle was at an impasse. Understanding that no support would come from government officials, Agnes appealed to several liberal organizations to intervene and draw public attention to the mine war. The St. Louis-based Social Justice Commission attempted to mediate the conflict and invited leaders of the United Mine Workers and the Progressive Miners to a face-to-face conference.
May 9th, 1933. Mr. John L. Lewis, President of the United Mine Workers of America. Dear Mr. Lewis, when nations meet around council tables in peace and amity to discuss the weightiest of problems and to adjudicate their difficulties, we believe that workers living under one flag and in one great democracy can do the same. We therefore extend an invitation to the Progressive Miners of America and to the United Mine Workers of America, each to send 3 representatives to meet in St. Louis.
The Social Justice Commission of St. Louis was composed of ministers of many denominations, as well as professors of Washington and St. Louis universities. In past years, it had worked to avert and settle a number of industrial disputes. The minutes of the May 1933 meeting of the Progressive Miners and the United Mine Workers record the only face-to-face encounter between Agnes Burns Wieck and United Mine Workers President John L. Lewis. American Civil Liberties Union Director Robert Morse Levitt was an observer at the meeting. He wrote an account in his autobiography.
At the conference, Lewis treated the group of perhaps 20 leading citizens of St. Louis to an oration of over an hour, delivered with a sound and fury that befitted an audience of 20,000. Among other charges, he asserted that the leaders of the progressives were disappointed office seekers who left the UMW in order to enjoy salaries and release from toil by holding office jobs.
The minutes of the meeting quote Lewis as saying,
"I don't know how to get together with men who have abandoned and reviled their union. If they were successful, history would uphold them as heroes of the labor movement. But they are not successful, and therefore their blood is upon their own heads."
Then there arose to her full 5 feet Agnes Wieck. For 20 minutes she excoriated him.
Mr. Lewis criticizes our women being on the picket line and says they should be at home. It is true. You will find no women's auxiliary among the UMW. They have nothing to appeal to the heroism of women. Mr. Lewis, or King John as he is called on the field, charges that our women spit in the faces of their men. This is the only crime we are charged with, that our women spit in the faces of men who were tear-gassing them. I asked the members of this commission, what would your women do? Pregnant women have been beaten with the sticks of your thugs. I talked to one who was dying after her baby had been born dead, and she cursed you when she died, Mr. Lewis.
Finally, Lewis sprang up like a tiger and rushed at Mrs. Wieck, shouting, "I won't stand for that!" His 2-hour oration was completely shot.
Clearly, the experience with Agnes was not something that left Lewis anytime soon. He said, "If there's anything that's caused us the great concern in some of our industrial conflicts, it has been the tendency of certain men to shove their women out on the picket lines while they remained at home and did the cooking." And I cannot imagine that he said that without a picture of Agnes in his mind.
Although Lewis was embarrassed at the meeting, he adamantly refused to yield on the demand for a statewide union election. He was emphatic that Illinois miners would not get the chance to choose their own union. There was no resolution, and the conflict went on. And although the progressive miners may have won the day before the Social Justice Commission, the meeting also exposed a growing rift within the new union.
The event with John L. Lewis and the Social Justice Commission is a good example of Agnes doing what Agnes thought was the right thing to do, and it may not have been exactly what the PMA leadership wanted her to do. So it was most likely at this moment that the PMA leadership began to sense that Agnes was their problem.
The schism between the leftist militants and the conservative wing of the progressives had widened since the union's founding less than a year earlier. While the militants supported mass action and expanded organizing, the conservatives favored legal maneuvers and currying the support of state and federal government. The conservatives understood that support of the government hinged on demonstrating that the progressive miners was an American union, untainted by left-wing ideas. They began to purge leftists from union leadership and staff positions. A man named Jerry Allard was the first casualty.
This is WCFL Chicago 11.
Today, we are in a serious crisis. We are fighting under conditions never before experienced by the labor movement.
Jerry Allard was a fervent and lifelong advocate for Illinois miners, and at age 24 was a founder of the insurgent PMA. He was named editor of the union newspaper, The Progressive Miner. He was also outspoken and associated with several left-wing organizations, including the Communist League of America. Jerry's wife, Irene Allard, discusses their politics in this 1974 interview.
I think Jerry and I were more socialist than anything. And I would say that half of the miners in the state of Illinois, at one time or other, gave money to the Communist Party or to the Socialist Party. And yet they were not members.
Since the Progressives were founded, the United Mine Workers attempted to discredit the new union by inaccurately casting it as a subversive communist organization. As part of that campaign, the UMWA red-baited Allard in its publication, the United Mine Workers Journal. Allard rigorously defended himself in the Progressive Miner newspaper.
The Communist Party has consistently attacked me for my activities in the Illinois minefields. I am not a member, let alone an executive of that organization.
I think red baiting is a uniquely powerful tool of elite forces in American society and had been since the 19th century.
Rosemary Foyer.
After World War I, lots of unions in the American Federation of Labor and in the UMWA simply used red baiting as a mechanism to get rid of dissenters of all sorts.
Agnes denounced the rising tide of red baiting and spoke out to defend Allard.
To have Jerry Allard called a communist will cause no panic in our ranks. Our auxiliary women have defied the coal corporations and their allies to do their worst, and they have done it. All the way from clubbing us to killing Emma Cumerlato and 6 of our progressive brothers. Can they terrorize us now with words? The red bugaboo holds no terrors for women who have faced tear gas, machine guns, and bayonets.
The anti-red purge in the progressive miners wasn't only an ideological fight or a simple power struggle. The progressive leaders believed that by purging leftists, they could curry favor with the federal government to win the struggle with the United Mine Workers. Again, Rosemary Foyer.
Well, the National Recovery Administration was telling every union, get rid of your radicals. So it wasn't just the PMA. They were saying, we'll deal with you only if you refuse to allow these radicals in your midst. And so if John O. Lewis is accusing the PMA of being radical, it made sense. Just get rid of the radicals and we'll build our stature among the new administration in Washington.
Soon after, the executive board of the union fired Jerry Allard and took aim at Agnes. The emboldened conservative leadership alienated her and moved to take control of the Women's Auxiliary. Agnes was barred from speaking at public events and attacked in the union's newspaper, but she had no intention of leaving early.
I spoke in the Harrisburg Auxiliary, and woman after woman got up and told me how certain PMA men had tried to poison them against me. The women all know that I am in for only one term, and I have told them over and over that under no circumstances would I consent to any change in the Constitution in order to run me again. I cannot spare the time or the strength any longer than this 1 year. My health is already giving way. But I will not permit these enemies of our union to push me aside. I will serve my term out and do my duty to the end. I have neglected my family and home and neglected myself. I have put this union and auxiliary above everything else in the world, even my own child. And now certain people try to brand me as a traitor.
Although Agnes was determined to complete her term, she and her allies faced a larger question. They had to decide whether she would be succeeded by a fellow militant, Sean Burns.
At the end of Agnes's term, it becomes very clear that she's being pushed out and that the left wing of the progressive movement is pretty unwanted. There was a choice there. If they fought back, then they would further splinter a splinter union. And I think that they made the strategic decision that they were better off stepping away. Because the Women's Auxiliary in the second year was not going to be the Illinois Women's Auxiliary that the women had signed on to be. It was not Agnes's vision.
Accounts of the second annual convention of the Illinois Women's Auxiliary vary widely. The Progressive Miner newspaper heralded a festive convention, although one where the PMA president issued a stern warning to the women.
Headline: Auxiliary women elect officers in second convention. Striking a keynote of solidarity, the historic Second Constitutional Convention of the Women's Auxiliary of the Progressive Miners of America got underway. The delegates were informed that President Claude Piercy, state president of the Progressive Miners of America, was present and would address them. President Piercy declared that he takes, quote, pride in the activities of the Women's Auxiliary, but that it is necessary that there be closer cooperation with the progressive miners.
The women tell a different story. Irene Allard, now writing for the dissident publication Fighting Miner, noted the resistance of the women as Union President Claude Piercy wrestled control of the Women's Auxiliary away from them. This is an actor reading from Irene's article.
November 15th, 1933. After a year of intensive fighting, led by Agnes Burns Wieck and other state officials, the reins of the Women's Auxiliary have been turned over. The new officers were elected by a minority vote, the majority of the delegates refusing to vote for the Piercy candidates. 14 nominations were made for the presidency, 13 declining to run for office. Reported by Irene Allard.
Exhausted and broke, Agnes reflected on the tumultuous past year and lamented the loss of the coal strike in a letter to a friend.
It is all over. I feel as if I had lived 100 years in one. So crowded with events has this past year been, so full of struggle, sacrifice, and death. When I finally got back to the farm in the dead of the night and looked out into the starlit space, looked through the branches of the big trees now bare of leaves, I wondered if all those terrible things had actually happened. I was not regretting that I had gone, but God, to think that this heroic struggle has come to naught, to think of the magnificent army and the lost opportunities.
I think Agnes and the other women of the auxiliary believed that there was a role for women in the unions that went beyond the traditional domestic role that auxiliaries had played before.
Sean Burns.
They could be involved, educated on the economic and political matters that affected their day-to-day lives, and that they should have some say-so. When Agnes is removed from the Women's Auxiliary, the vision of seeing women moving forward collectively in the economic sphere with their families is really squashed. For the Women's Auxiliary, once again, it's the death of an idea.
It's not a pleasant, uplifting story in the end.
Rosemary Foyer.
Oftentimes it's like you can't understand how people could go on when they're trying to express themselves as true Americans, which is what Agnes Burns Wieck and the auxiliary or any of the number of people who fought for their rights. And you think, how could they have gone on and believed in democratic governance after they faced this raw fact? You know, we did get change in the 1930s and a new union movement was brought about, but not the one that might have been brought about if repression had not been used. It was not a safe thing to be an activist in the 1930s.
Irene Allard, from that 1974 interview.
Well, they couldn't have found anyone that would have suited the presidency as much as Agnes Burns Wieck did, see. She was a little, well, they called her the Hellcat. So she organized.
Yeah, Burns was, too.
Yeah, she brought them in.
As Agnes predicted, the strike was lost. The use of violence and strike breakers effectively broke the progressive picket lines, and key Peabody mines reopened. Shifting focus from the picket line to the halls of political power, leaders of the progressive miners scrambled to win recognition and legitimacy in the newly formed New Deal government. But that strategy failed too. John L. Lewis used his influence within the labor movement and in government to prevent the progressives from gaining legitimacy. As a result, Lewis and the United Mine Workers prevailed in Illinois, and Union democracy wouldn't be restored to Illinois miners until the 1970s. Some progressives remained with the Union in the few mines that the PMA was able to organize. Others left the Union and returned to the United Mine Workers in humiliation. Some left coal mining altogether. Following the takeover of the Women's Auxiliary by the Progressive Miners' leadership, the women's organization forfeited its independence and stature as an equal partner with the men in the Illinois Union struggle. However, a few still remember their militant origins. Dominic Bertonetti, Jr.
I can still hear one of the meetings that apparently my mother brought me along. They were singing, on progressives, we are here to stay, you know, and they were all singing, mouths open, and really, you know, bellowing out those words. I can still remember that. Yeah, they were a force. They were a force. Yeah.
You've been listening to We Were Not Ladies, We Were Women. It was produced by Greg Boozell with help from John Bewin and Karen Everett. For a complete list of credits and more information, visit mindwar.org. I'm Kim Holmes.